Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, I'd like to share with you an interesting and very instructive game that focuses on controlling an open file as well as the importance of a pin. This game was played by one of the best attacking players of his time, Spielmann, against Wahle from 1926. This is how the game started. e4, e6, French defense, d4, d5. This is the first crossroad in the game where White needs to decide what type of position he chooses to play. One of the choices is to push the pawn ahead, which would be called the advanced variation, where, as you can see, the pawn structure in the middle of the board is very defined and it's likely to stay this way for many more moves to come. Black's typical answer to that would be playing c5. White could immediately trade pawns in the middle by capturing on d5, but that would result in a very symmetrical type of position. Two other moves that are very common and are considered as the main moves are to protect the pawn with the knight, either from d2 or, as Spielmann continued, from c3. And now Black is the one that needs to choose direction, which way to go. In addition to the game continuation, a very interesting and sharp game would arise after Black developing the bishop and creating a pin immediately on the white knight on c3 and directly attacking the pawn on e4 through the pin. This typically leads to very exciting and eventful games, most often continuing with e5, c5, followed by a3, bishop capture, pawn captures, and basically White can develop an attack on the king's side because Black is missing his dark squared bishop, while of course Black has a better pawn structure and is hoping to survive the middle game, that is, not to get checkmated, and hoping for an endgame or holding off White's attack and then coming out ahead because of their superior pawn structure later in the game. Let's go back to this position. Here, instead of bishop b4, Black also may trade pawns on e4 right away, which has become relatively popular in recent years. And then, of course, there is the game move, which is the other main move next to bishop b4, and that is playing knight f6, developing on the king's side and putting pressure again on the e4 pawn. And again, it's decision time for White. Should White push the pawn through and attack Black's knight? Of course, that's a main line and a pretty good move. Should White create a pin himself? Certainly another good idea, because this threatens to win a pawn immediately. Even if now Black would play h6, attacking that bishop, White would immediately gain advantage after trading on f6, because now Black cannot afford recapturing with the queen and maintaining his healthy pawn structure, because the queen is busy protecting the pawn on d5. If the queen would capture the bishop, pawn would take pawn on d5, and after Black captures back on d5, knight d5, luckily for White, the check on e6, which seems to be a good fork, checking the white king and attacking the knight on d5, in reality doesn't bring any fruits for Black, because the knight can retreat from the attack and block the check at the same time and maintain the extra pawn. Therefore, after bishop g5, h6, and bishop takes knight, Black wanting to avoid the loss of material, will be forced to recapture with the pawn and therefore have a very pitiful pawn structure on the king side with 3 isolated pawns, 2 of them doubled, giving white a clear advantage. Let's go back again to the position after knight f6. In the game, white actually, instead of bishop g5, pinning the knight, immediately decided to trade pawns on d5. Now, this is a little bit deceiving because a lot of people think that trading pawns on d5 in the French and therefore creating a very symmetrical pawn structure leads to a drawish game. Sometimes it is true, especially when a bunch of pieces get traded off early on and the game leads to an endgame, when indeed having a symmetrical pawn structure brings the game closer to a draw ending. However, you'll see in this game that things are by far not quite as simple, and good play is required in order to maintain the balance. White here continued by playing bishop to g5, pinning the knight, and now this resembles some similar patterns and ideas that we discussed a minute ago when the bishop went to g5 right away. Again, just like in that variation, without the immediate trade of pawns on d5, now white is threatening to capture the black knight on f6 and forcing black to ruin their pawn structure and recapture with a pawn unless another piece comes forward and protects the pawn on d5, liberating the queen from this task. Now, this resembles some similar ideas and patterns that we discussed at the comments with the previous move, when white had the option not to trade pawns immediately on d5, but pin the knight with bishop g5 on the fourth move. Again, if now black is careless, for example, attacks the bishop by playing h7 to h6, white would trade the bishop for the knight, and again, the only way black could avoid losing a pawn is by recapturing with the pawn and therefore ruining the pawn structure. So at this moment, what black needs to do is to liberate their queen and bring another piece forward, protecting the pawn on d5. So if white will choose on the next move to capture on f6, the queen will be able to recapture without the loss of the d5 pawn. Black made a very natural move by moving the bishop to e7. On one hand, this move develops, prepares castling, unpins the knight, and gets ready in case white captures on f6 to recapture with a piece other than the pawn from g7, with the bishop namely, and have a good position. In a situation like this, of course, it would make no sense whatsoever for white to trade on f6, because white would just be giving up his pair of bishops for no reason, not ruining black's pawn structure because the bishop is free to recapture. White made a very natural and good move, namely developing their own other bishop to d3, and with that taking away the f5 square, which is typically a good square in this opening, from the black bishop. I would recommend in this position, and probably in the next couple of moves as well, for black to simply castle. Black instead played perhaps an overambitious move, playing knight c6, attacking the pawn on d4. Of course, white does not need to slow down. White can and should continue developing at the same time while protecting that pawn on d4. White has two natural-looking moves, both with a knight from g1, either going to f3 or to e2. Typically, in most openings, the knight is more active on f3 than it is on e2. However, there can be exceptions to that, and this is one of those cases. If white right now would develop the knight to f3, it would allow for black to create an unpleasant pin by moving the bishop to g4 and therewith put further attack on the d4 pawn. Probably at this stage, white's best option would be to retreat the bishop to e2 to unpin the knight and protect the pawn on d4. But if you look carefully at the position on the board right now, you will see complete symmetry. However, with a big difference. Even though, normally speaking, it's supposed to be to white's favor having a completely symmetrical position, but that's assuming that white is a move ahead, since white starts the game. However, that is not the case here, because the white bishop lost a move by first moving to d3 and then back to e2, actually giving that time advantage to the opponent, to the black side. So as we know, at this position it's black's turn, and in a complete symmetry, that's always an advantage. Therefore, developing the knight to f3 in this very case is inferior to developing the knight to e2. If in this position, black again would try to develop the bishop to g4, pinning the knight, and threaten the pawn on d4, the big difference is that now white could simply unpin the knight, for example, by playing f3, and then continue on with their own plans. Let's go back again to the game continuation, where black chose to go after the white bishop by playing knight to b4. It's an interesting idea. However, the drawback is that black is wasting a lot of time accomplishing this, although I would not call it a mistake. White played knight g3, getting the knight ready for the attack on the king's side, and black follows up what he started, namely capturing the bishop on d3. With a check, white of course recaptures with the queen, and this is the start of things going wrong for black. Black, of course, should be castling. It's usually not a good idea to delay putting the king into safety and try to make other moves at an early stage of the game. Black should castle here. Instead, black chose to play g6, trying to completely neutralize the knight on g3 by controlling the f5 and h5 squares. Well, that's all nice and beautiful. However, g6 at the same time also weakens dark squares such as g7 and h6. White has castled. At this point, it's quite notable that white has an advantage in development. If you look, pretty much all the white pieces, especially the minor pieces, are developed, and so is the white queen. The rooks are connected. White has castled. White is ready on the next move to occupy the only open file in the position. In the meantime, black hasn't castled yet, hasn't developed the light squared bishop yet, not connected the rooks obviously, and perhaps even more importantly, has some weaknesses on the dark squares that may be unpleasant. Nevertheless, black should have castled here and would probably be still okay. Instead, black wasted another overcautious move by playing c6. If you have time for everything, of course, this is a move that fits in the harmony in the position by protecting the pawn and therefore liberating the knight from f6 for a potential jump away. However, there was no need for it at this moment. It's very important to be aware of our priorities, and certainly in the early part of the game, putting our king to safety is a priority. And now white played a very natural and strong move, putting the rook from a1 to e1 on the open file, immediately creating a pin over the black bishop and therefore creating a very serious and very immediate threat by capturing the knight on f6. Black has castled. Let's examine for a moment what would happen if instead black would play bishop to e6 and neutralize the pin that way. Try to think for a moment, as an attacking player, what should white play here? If white just makes very quiet moves, unambitious moves, black will be just fine. Black will castle, perhaps even considering castle into the queen side, and having a pair of bishops, black will be without any problems. However, if white plays ambitiously, namely playing f4, black will continue having problems after f5 and the opening of the f4g files. Let's go back to the game where black at this moment has castled immediately. Actually, this pretty much leads to an immediate loss. Try to think and analyze the position, preferably without moving the pieces and surely without the help of any chess software. Try to come to the solution by yourself and then come back and see if you found the same beautiful way to win the game as Spielman did. White sacrificed the rook for a bishop. Queen captured back. And now the pin, of course, is again very much alive. White immediately goes and plays queen f3, putting pressure on the knight. The knight cannot be moved without losing the queen. And now black has only one way to protect the knight with the king. The only other alternative would be to play bishop f5, trying to give up a pawn after knight takes and pawn takes. Quite interestingly, it's best in this position not to capture the pawn, after which king g7 would lead to an okay position for black, but here the winning sequence is playing queen g3, creating a check, a discovered check by bishop takes knight, and then if the king moves out to the corner, then queen h4, attacking the knight through an x-ray, and then already if king g7, queen h6 decides the game real quick. But how to continue after black protects the knight with the king? And this is quite beautiful that white can and should sacrifice a knight also to use the pin. That's exactly what happened in the game. Pawn took, knight took. And now white is attacking the knight threefold. Moreover, if bishop would be able to take the knight, that would be a check and a fork. But the black queen can get out of that fork, and in fact, that's what black did. Now, at this moment, even though white has won back some of the material, black is still ahead, having a rook for a knight and a pawn. But now, white, finding the correct move, will create a winning attack. And that move is moving the queen to f4, aiming to go to h6, and with all reality, there's not much that black can do about it. just like about the following checkmate on g7. A very impressive game, really short, but very instructive. And now let's see a very famous endgame. Here we go. I would call this also the jewel of the week. In this position, white seems to be down, black has a rook while white only has a pawn. However, that pawn is very far advanced. In fact, it's only 2 squares away from promotion. The first move is quite obvious and forced. Pawn to advance to c7. And in fact, at this moment, it is black who needs to worry about how to stop that pawn from promoting. It's not hard to come to the conclusion that the only way to accomplish that is to check the king. And now comes the big question, how can white win this game? Anytime the white king would go down to the 7th rank, along with the white pawn on c7, that pawn would be pinned. For example, king b7, rook d7, and then the rook could simply give itself up for the pawn and draw the game immediately. If the white king would go to c5 on the same file with the pawn, the black rook would go back down to the 1st or 2nd rank and then make a skewer on the c file as soon as the white pawn promotes. Moving the king to the a file would be the worst, because then the black rook would get behind the pawn and even win the game. So, after c7, rook d6, the only way to try to win is to go on the b file, go to b5. Now, black must keep giving checks and hoping for all the same patterns, that if the white king moves to the c file, the rook moves back to the 1st rank and then give a skewer from behind on c1. If the king moves to the a file, the rook gets behind the pawn on c5. If the king goes back to b6, rook just would go also back to d6, repeating moves, leaving white with only one try to keep going to b4. And then the check comes again, king b3, and the check comes again. And now it seems like game over, because the white king moves to c2 and there is no file or rank 0 where the black rook could come down to and then give a skewer from behind. It's true that black ran out of checks too. Nevertheless, black has a very, very tricky move. And that move is to move the rook to d4. Threatening, of course, to fork the pawn and the king with a check on c4. But how about if the white pawn promotes to a queen? A queen typically is an easy win against the rook. However, not in this case, because black is able to give his rook up and force stalemate. Quite an amazing trick, isn't it? Nevertheless, white can win this game from this position. Not by promoting to a queen, neither by playing king c3 when the rook would just come down to d1 and then after king c2 go back to d4, but by promoting the pawn to a rook. That's called under promotion. Typically, rook versus rook is an immediate draw. However, not in this case, because right now white is about to checkmate black on the a file thanks to the unfortunate position of the black king. But in the meantime, black is able to stop that by moving the rook to a4. And now white has a winning move by moving the king to b3, attacking black's rook. And because the black rook is too close in distance to the white king, black is not able to give any sensible check. And by the time the rook moves away, white is ready to checkmate on c1. A very beautiful example of beauty in the endgames. Thank you for listening. Until next week. Bye-bye.